Okay, good morning, everyone. I see a few people are here. Karen's here. Good morning, Karen. Baha's here. Good morning, Baha. Good morning, Mashid. Ivan's here. Good evening, Ivan. Um, KC's here. Good morning, KC. Good morning, Thika. And good morning, Erica. Duong's here. Good morning. Um, how are you feeling this morning in an emoji? I'm feeling I'm feeling sunglasses emoji with smiling emoji with sunglasses. That's how I'm feeling this morning. Hi, Jenna. How are you guys feeling emoji wise? How are you guys feeling this morning? I say I'm gonna go with cool sunglasses guy. Karen still sleepy? Yeah, it's okay. That's what this is for, Karen. How else? How else is everyone doing? Jenna, okay. Jenna's super happy. All right, that's cool. Casey, that one doesn't come up, or that one doesn't come up, but I know what you're saying there. That one doesn't come up either, but I get it. Rashid's feeling pretty good. Okay, that's good. How long is that progress bar, Baja? Is that going to be like for a minute or an hour or? Okay, so what we'll do today is a couple things. We'll talk a little bit more about systemic racism and how we can see evidence of that systemic inequality or structural inequality, how we can see it in statistics, how we can see it in the big numbers. Because again, hang on, I'll get to that in a second. We'll do that. Then we'll see what kind of what kind of statistics or numbers you came up with on your own, and maybe we can talk about a few of those. I'm curious to see what you found. And then I have an article for you to read, and it's a it's a real deal, serious academic article. But I want to give you a few tips for reading these larger, complicated articles because if you go on to university, and as far as I know, I think many of you would like to do that. If you do go on to university, you're going to have to deal with academic papers, and they're a bit of a pain in the butt because they're usually long, they're usually quite boring, but there are a few ways to cut down on your reading and sort of get the understanding of them at least. Okay, so we'll talk about that a little bit later, but first we'll do the structural or systemic racism and the numbers or the statistics thing. Caleb's here. Good morning, Caleb. And okay, Baha's doing his workout at the same time. Good morning, Jimmy. Okay, let's dive into this. Okay, so yesterday we kind of started here, and this was a slide from one of the first classes, I think, maybe class 2 or class 3 or something. And one of the things that we wanted to do in this class in order to understand the material that was in front of us is that we wanted to let go of personal anecdotal evidence and look at broad social patterns. And so what I meant by that is that when we have one situation, when we have a personal experience, when we're reading the story of one person in the newspaper, it doesn't necessarily prove things are one way or the other, right? Because there are lots of individual experiences and things are complicated, right? And so we have to look, if we're looking for inequality in a society as a whole, we have to have some way to measure that inequality for the whole society, and that's where statistics come in. And so again, one personal instance or experience does not prove or disprove anything usually. We need to look at the broader numbers, okay? And so that's kind of what we were doing yesterday. We were looking at the very basics of some statistical knowledge. And again, statistics is kind of a science in itself. and it's rather complicated. I don't have a solid understanding of it. I've had some exposure to statistics in some of the courses that I've done and in my graduate work, but I'm very, very far away from an expert. And so I'm just giving you a couple things to help us understand some of the numbers that we see before us, okay? So I asked you when we're talking about numbers like this, I said we should pay attention to three things. We should pay attention to sample size and over and under representation, and what the data are actually telling us, right? So I got rid of that fish example because that didn't make any sense. But yesterday we talked about if I wanted to measure your performance in this course. So if I wanted to measure how well you knew all of the social justice topics that we talked about in this course on a final exam, there isn't a final exam, but if I wanted to measure that, how many questions should I ask you? And I think, although some of you said one, and I understand the logic behind that, from a teacher's perspective, that's not a very good choice, because if I ask you one question, really all you can get are 0 and 100%, right? And if really, if you're supposed to get a 70%, if that's the amount of stuff then asking you one question won't get me a very representative picture of what you know, right? It's not a representative sample. It's not big enough. Same thing with two questions. You could score a 0 or a 50 or 100%, but it's not very representative of the whole, right? And so maybe if I ask you 10 questions, well, now we're getting a little bit closer, right? And so really the more questions I ask you, the better measure I have of what you actually know. But of course, there's a limit to that, right? So if I ask you 100 questions, I would probably get something very close to 70%, which is kind of where your actual mark should be. If I ask you 1,000 questions, well, we're not going to get it much closer to 70%, right? If I ask you 10,000 questions, it's not going to move very much either, right? So there's a limit to sort of how much information you can get from a sample. Eventually, the needle doesn't move, right? And so if I ask you one question, you could be at 0 or 100. If I ask you two questions, you could be at 0 or 50 or 100. But the more questions I ask you, the more that sort of needle will zero in on 70%, which is where you should be. And I can keep asking you questions until the end of time, but it really won't move the needle, right? It won't be any more accurate. So there's always kind of a maximum that if you keep sampling, you don't get any more information, okay? But that's kind of more than we need to know. So the larger our population is, so the larger of total people or total cases, the larger our sample size has to be. So again, if we want to know how many people like to eat at McDonald's in Canada, we can't just ask 4 people, right? Because we have 36 million people in Canada. 4 people is not enough, right? We're going to need a bigger sample. But if we want to know how many people like McDonald's in our class, and there's only 19 people, 4 is good, right? 4 is almost, 4 is a reasonable percentage of the population. If we want to know how many people like to eat at McDonald's in Canada, we might have to ask, 1,000 or 2,000 people, and even that would be a small sample. But again, it becomes difficult to ask 20 and 30,000 people a question, right? So there's a limit to how many people you can ask as well. Okay, I think we're good there. The more important one is the over or under representation, right? So in order to understand some numbers, we need to know whether some groups are over or under represented. And so the example I gave you yesterday was that in our class, we have roughly 50% guys and girls, and I know that I'm ignoring other genders there, but forgive me if that's the case. We have roughly 50% guys and girls in our class, and so if 4 people get A's at the end of the term, how many guys versus how many girls should get A's? And I think most of us said that, well, probably two and two, right? If you have half guys and half girls, in, you know, if all of the other things are equal, half of the A's should go to the guys and half of the A's go to the girls. But this is a really small sample, and so it could very well be that three A's go to girls and only one A goes to a guy. And so is that a problem, right? Is that should we do something? Is there something wrong? But again, because we have such a small sample size, it's very possible that we could have 3 and 1 or 1 and 3 or maybe 4, right? Maybe all A's could go to the girls or all A's could go to the guys. It's such a small sample that we can't really tell anything. But imagine if we looked at the college as a whole with 2,400 students. If we saw that 75% of A students were girls, that might cause us to ask a question, right? We might want to ask, well, why is that the case? You would think that the A's would be equal, and yet girls are getting A's far more often. Why is that, right? And so there may be some bias in our teaching. There may be some bias in our marking. There may be outside factors, right? Maybe male students are expected to work more than female students, and so male students have more going on outside of school, and so their academic performance suffers. Could be all kinds of different things happening, right? But when we see a big difference like that, and we see a large sample, we should ask the question, right? We should ask the question, what is going on? Why is that? And the last thing we said is, what is the data actually telling us here? And so lots of what we read in the paper are polls. And so people say, the question is, how many people think this, or how many people think that? And those are very good to sort of get a measure or get a reading on what people out there in the world actually think about things. That's really important, especially to politicians, right? Politicians want to know what people think and how people feel about issues. But again, that's really all they tell us. They just tell us how people feel and what people think. And so again, if 70% of people say that they believe in ghosts, well, that doesn't mean that ghosts exist. It just means that people believe in them, right? So we need to be careful and understand what the numbers are actually telling us, okay? And finally, look at how you can compare the numbers to each other, right? So again, if you're looking at the number of people murdered in Canada in 2016, 600 people seems like a lot, right? If you compare it with the number of people murdered in the United States in that year, 17,000 people, wow, that's a lot of people. But is the murder rate worse in Canada than the US? Well, it's hard to tell because the US population is so much bigger than ours. So we have to get a common denominator. Sorry about the math, by the way, but we have to create a common denominator. And so here we have a measure out of 100,000 people. And here you can see that actually, many more people in the US get murdered than in Canada. And we've been able to sort of compare the numbers because we've used a common denominator there. So if you're going to be comparing statistics, make sure that the numbers are actually comparable. And then also pay attention to the assumptions you might make about the meaning of data, okay? So the numbers show us what the patterns are, but they don't explain them, right? So again, if we go back to our example, if at the college we see that 75% of A students are girls, your automatic assumption might be, oh, girls are smarter than guys, or girls are better students than guys. And that might be true, but it also might not be true, right? And so without any sort of evidence, this is our critical thinking happening here, without any sort of evidence, we really don't know what we're seeing, right? All we're seeing is a pattern. We're seeing that more A students happen to be girls. Why is that? We're not sure. Is it a problem? It depends on what the reasons are for that inequality, right? So your brain is going to be very quick to want to explain some of these things, but usually we want to wait and think it through, Okay, so again, numbers don't tell us anything. We have to interpret them. We have to analyze them, and you don't want to you don't want to jump to conclusions too quickly. So here I have the example. Yeah, the murder rate is higher in the U.S. Is that because of their gun laws? Maybe, maybe not. Is it because they're a more violent society? Well, who knows? Maybe, maybe not. Do they have a different legal definition of murder? Do they report murders better? Are they more likely to charge people with murder in certain cases? It's hard to know, right? We have to sort of dig into the details and find out why we're seeing the pattern, okay? Right. So, let me just check in with you. Do those things make sense? Do you feel comfortable with what I've told you about statistics and numbers? And I know um, it's just a little bit that we're dealing with, and I hope I did a good job explaining it. But do you have any questions at the moment about the sample sizes, or about the over or under representation, or about kind of thinking about what the numbers actually tell us and what they don't tell us? Yes, you do have a question? Okay. Or no, or yes. Yes, you get it? Yes, it's okay? Okay, I'm going to assume that's what it is. Baja's seems good. KC's good. Mashid is good. So it's all based on percentage. Often what you'll see, Karen, is numbers based on percentages, or on ratios, or with common denominators, like we saw out of 100,000, which is kind of like using a percent anyway, because that's what allows you to compare these things, right? Otherwise, if I go back to, let me just go back a slide or two. Yeah. So in this example here, again, we don't know who's got the worst murder rate, because the numbers are just kind of hard to deal with in your head, right? Okay, we've got 600 people killed out of 35 million, and then we've got 17,000 people killed out of 323 million. Wow, both of the Canadian numbers seem small, both of the American numbers seem large, but is the US more dangerous than Canada, right? Do you have a greater chance of being murdered? It's hard to tell unless we find a way to make the numbers comparable. And so percentages is one way to do that. Common denominators is another way to do that. Ratios are another way to do that as well. So it's a way in which we can make these things comparable. Another way you could do it, and this is often they do maybe not just economically, they'll do a per capita comparison. And so per capita means per person. So often you'll see, if you know anything about economics, you'll see countries reporting their GDP per capita. And so their GDP is their gross domestic product. And so that's kind of all the financial activity in the country for the whole year. They add it all up, however many billions of dollars it is, and then they divide it out by their population. And so then you can actually compare the economic activity of countries that are very, very different in terms of their size and their population, but you can also compare them according to their economic activity. And so even if one country has, this many billions of dollars of economic activity, and this one has this many billion, you can actually compare them on a similar scale. Okay, does that make sense? I'm gonna hope so. As always, if a question comes up, you can always fly it into the live stream. I can see it right here beside me, so I can always answer anything that comes up. Okay. Now I think we're at the point where. Oh, okay, we're not at that point, but I'm just gonna go through this really quickly because we've seen this yesterday. Okay, so again, life expectancy. If we look in the U.S., we see that. Okay, Karen's good. Awesome. um, we see that your life expectancy is shorter in the US if you are a black person, right? And so um, that's significant, right? Because that's a really big sample size. They keep track of everyone who dies in the US every year for years, right? The numbers are really big. The sample size is really big here. And so these these percentages here, not percentages, but these estimates of years, they're very accurate. And so, yeah, as a black man, you can expect to live about almost 4.5 years less than a white man, right? That's pretty significant. 4.5 years is a long time. And it's this one particular racial group that suffers from it. This was a pretty significant statistic as well, right? Because the sample sizes are really large. We can measure household income really easily from tax records. Black households are far below the average in terms of how much money they make, right? In terms of poverty rate, you are much more likely to live below the poverty line as a black family in the US than as a white one. We looked at this one. So the percent of the population in prison. Incidentally, this is a bit of an aside, but the US has a massive amount of their population in prison as compared to other countries. And so I don't know, that should be mentioned. So if we look, here's where our over and under representation measure of statistics comes in, right? If you look at black men are only 13% of the population. Actually, black people in the US are only 13% of the US population, but in prison, they make up 40% of people who are in jail. And so that's a big difference, right? That's a really big difference. And you can see here on the far right, they've actually made it a common denominator as well. And so you can see that white men make up 450 of every 100,000 prisoners. But wait, am I reading that right? No, I'm not reading that right. Sorry. You can see though that they've used a common denominator here on the right. And so white men make up 450 per 100,000 in terms of how many people are in prison, but black men are much, much more likely to be in prison. Right? So they are overrepresented in the prison population. And so that brings us to this. So yesterday I asked you to take a little bit of time on the internet and see if you could find some statistics that led us to believe that there was systemic racism existed. And so I'm curious to know what you came up with. So maybe just fly those into the live chat there, and we'll see what we come up with. Okay. So what did you find? What did you find? What'd you come up with there, people? Anything? It's pretty quiet. Okay, here we go. Okay, interesting. So 67% of doctors have bias against African American patients. Yeah, that is interesting. It would be interesting to know how they determine that, right? Because sometimes people's biases are unconscious, right? So they don't realize that they have them. But that's a significantly high number, right? If you are black and you go to a doctor in the U.S., you have basically a 2 in 3 chance, more than a 2 in 3 chance of having a doctor who has some sort of bias, probably against you, right? So that's not great. That's not comforting, right? Thika says, according to one study, white families hold 90% of national wealth. Latino families hold 2.3, black families 2.6. Yeah. So that's a pretty surprising statistic. And again, the sample sizes and the numbers are really big here, right? Because economics are easy to track. And so, like, this statistic here, it's a little more difficult to figure out who has bias and who doesn't, right? And I'm not saying saying that this statistic is wrong. In fact, there's a lot of research around this that suggests that that's the case. But this one, there are really big numbers, and money is easy to track, and so that's a big difference, right? For one racial group to hold 90% of national wealth. However, what we might want to think about in this one is something we already know, is that black people are a minority in the US, so they're only 13% of the population. So in theory, even if everyone was equal and everyone had the same amount of money, black families would still have a smaller piece of the national wealth because they're a smaller group of people. So this one is interesting because it's a little bit misleading. It seems really bad, but we would probably need more information to really understand it, right? Because again, if everyone in the US had the same amount of money, you would expect that white people would have more money overall because there's just simply more of them, and there are fewer black people, there are fewer Hispanic people. So this is a good one. This is a good one, Thika, because it doesn't look great on the surface. It looks bad, and there is an issue of economic inequality connected to this, but this statistic isn't really as reliable, because again, you would expect this to be the case. You would expect that if everyone had the same amount of money, black people in total would have less because there just are fewer of them, right? But our statistic about median household wealth is a little more revealing, right? Because then we can see that on average, black families actually earn less. And so it doesn't have anything to do with the total numbers of people. Karen says median wealth among white households, okay, here, is 171,000, while black households is 17,000. Yeah, so this is the amount of wealth that people have. And so this is connected to Thika's, but this statistic looks bad. It looks bad for black families, but it doesn't really tell us what we need to know, because again, we would expect a minority to have less wealth, right? This one doesn't tell us as much, but this one does, right? On average, white families have far, far more wealth than black families do, right? That should be a bit of a red flag to us, right? That should be, yeah, so that's good. What else? What else you got? Give me more. Give me more, give me more. What else do you have? All of these are good, by the way, because there's no wrong answers, right? Either they tell us something about statistics, or they tell us something about systemic racism. There's no wrong answers here. Mm-hmm. Okay, well maybe we have to leave that one. Okay, so oh, one more here. Ah, 30% people, 30% more likely. Yeah, black drivers are 30% more likely to be pulled over than white drivers. So that's an interesting statistic, and it is problematic. Um, of course, we would want to know how these people came to that number, right? How did they determine? Did they go through police records? If they did, then those numbers would be very accurate. But there are a number of different measures about um, which racial groups get more police attention, and those statistics seem to back this idea up, right? That visible um, people in minoritized groups, so in the US, black people and Hispanic people, both of them tend to get more police attention than do white people, which again should raise a bit of a flag for us because we know that white people are in the majority in the US. And so if you count everything up, white people should get more police attention because there's more of them, right? And so, in terms of who the police pull over and who the police want to talk to, it seems that black people are overrepresented in that category. Okay, so we can see all these numbers, and of course, the question is, why did these patterns exist? What's the explanation for what we see? And it's important to think about theory and an ideology and the way that we see the world, because of course the way that we see the world, the things that we believe, are the lens through which we see these numbers and the lens through which we are interpreting them, right? And so think about, for instance, when we were talking about the A students, and let's say that 75% of A students at Columbia College were girls and only 25% were guys. Now, all of us would probably have a very quick explanation for why that was, and some quick explanations showed up in the live chat here. And what I want to point out to you is that the way that you explain that number, the way that you see that number or that pattern, will probably have a lot to do with who you are, right? So your school experience, your upbringing, your gender, right? Girls might be inclined to see that number more favorably than guys. You would interpret that number based on the sort of lens you were looking through, okay? And so all of the numbers that we just saw with regard to different racial groups in the US can be interpreted in a number of different ways depending on what we believe is true, right? And so historically, many people have been operating according to kind of a cultural deficit theory. And this kind of approach starts out at the very beginning of the United States, in the sort of 17 and 1800s, and in Europe and other places as well, and in Canada. But the idea here is that there is a difference. These differences exist, these patterns exist because there is something wrong with the culture you're talking about. And so in the past, minoritized groups were blamed for their struggles, right? And so if we imagine the statistic where black households made less money than white households on average, people would explain that by saying, well, obviously black people need to work harder, right? That's the explanation for the pattern. And that ties into that ideology of meritocracy that we talked about as well, right? The idea that everybody gets where they are just by working hard. And that's the only variable there is, right? So people who have lots of money and success have worked hard. People who are not successful, clearly they didn't work hard enough and they need to work harder, right? That's kind of that's what meritocracy believes. And so if you believe very strongly in meritocracy, you might look at those numbers and say, well, clearly some people are working harder than others, right? But of course, what we've been talking about in this course is that it's not really the way it works. Hard work is part of it, but there are lots of other variables, there are lots of other obstacles. And minoritized groups in the US have more obstacles in the way than do the dominant group, than do white people. And so, but historically, and even today, unfortunately, some people believe that these patterns are not the fault of any sort of system or structural inequality. They just have to do with individual characteristics. And so, but again, what I'm trying to argue here, or trying to convince you of, is that we have to think about not just individual people and their individual work habits. We actually have to think about historical and institutional and cultural racism, right? And what we've seen, what we've talked about, and we saw a video on it, I think yesterday, is that there are a lot of obstacles in the way for people in minoritized groups. And this doesn't just have to do with race, but of course we're talking about race here. We said that people of color tend to go to schools that are underfunded. We saw that in the video yesterday, that that schools in the US are funded by the property taxes of the neighborhood around them. And so if you live in a poor neighborhood, the property taxes are lower, which means the school that is funded by those property taxes doesn't have as much money, which means it can't buy cool educational resources, it can't take cool field trips, it can't pay good salaries to get good teachers. And so people who go to that school maybe don't get as good of an education as people who go to schools in wealthier neighborhoods, right? And we've already seen from the numbers that Black Americans tend to have lower incomes. They are more likely to live below the poverty line, and they have less net wealth, which I think just came up. So poorer neighborhoods in the US are more likely to have Black inhabitants, right? Black people living in the neighborhood. They are going to send their children to their neighborhood school. Their neighborhood school is not going to be able to give them a great education because they just don't have a lot of money, right? And so again, you can see these things are starting to be connected, right? Their economic disadvantage is now connected to an educational disadvantage. Poor access to healthcare. Now, this is not so much the case in Canada, and we'll talk about Canada shortly. But in the US doesn't have universal healthcare like Canada does. Although things have changed with the sort of Obamacare package that was passed a number of years ago, basically the US works on health insurance. And so if you want medical care in the US, you have to buy your own insurance. If you don't have any insurance, when you go to the hospital, when you're done, they're going to give you a bill. They're going to give you an invoice, and it's going to be massive. But of course, who's not going to have insurance? Well, people who live below the poverty line, right? People who live below the poverty line do not make enough money to feed and clothe and house themselves. And so do they have money left over for health insurance? No. If they get sick, what's going to happen to them? Well, they may not be able to go to the hospital, and they may die, or they might not be able to afford the treatment that they need. And so, again, does that mean lower life expectancies for Black Americans? Maybe it does, right? Does it mean that maybe they're sick and they can't go to work, and so they lose even more money? Yeah, it probably does. So again, these things start to be connected, right? Your ability to access healthcare is connected to your economic status, but you're much more likely to have lower economic status if you are a Black American, right? These things start to be connected. We saw in the video that peoples of color, Black Americans, have historically been denied mortgages and loans and investment. And that's what helps you build wealth, right? That's what helps you build wealth that you can then pass down to your children, and they can build it and pass down to their children. The white families in the US have had an advantage in this way for a long time. And so their families have built wealth, some families have built wealth generationally. But black people in the US have been, for the most part, denied taking part in this system. And so they don't accumulate any wealth for every generation. They just kind of stay where they are. And again, we see lots of evidence of unequal treatment in every other social institution. And so there's unequal treatment in education, which we've talked about, in healthcare. Baha mentioned that there's actually prejudice or discrimination that happens actually in the doctor's office. There's various types of economic discrimination. Banks are involved. The criminal justice system is involved, and policing, which of course is very prominent in the news right now. And so you can see that all of these things start to connect to each other, and they start to feed off each other, right? They start to actually work as a system to disadvantage one group and advantage another, okay? And so that's kind of what the numbers are suggesting to us here, is that we have a greater problem, and all of these individual things, whether they be property taxes or the U.S. Sort of healthcare system, whether it's prejudicial or racist views and just people having racist thoughts or discriminating, people discriminating against names on resumes, right? We read that study where people with black sounding names were less likely to be called back. All of these things start to add up, right? And they start to create large scale inequalities within society. And so this is where we're kind of going with this idea of structural racism, is that it's not any one person's fault, and no one has to really do anything specific. It's just the way that the system works. It's the way that the machine of society works. And again, the result is that we see these numbers showing up in very broad sections of society where people of color are disadvantaged. Okay. And so that's what we see. We see evidence of structural racism here when we look at larger patterns within society. And so I think the numbers we see show us that there are large sections of the American population that are struggling financially, educationally, health-wise, mental health-wise, and the groups that are struggling are very clearly connected to race, right? There is a racial inequality in this country and in that country that disadvantage these people, right? And you can see it in the big numbers. Okay. Does that make sense? Do you see that? Do you understand it? Are you confused about something? Does it conflict with something that you already feel or already know? Is it in alignment with what you already know? What do you think? What do you think? Okay, so Casey, I'm going to say is okay. Baja's good. Banamere is good. Good morning, Banamere. Erica's okay. All right. She's good. I have another question for you. There's only 9 of you here. Where is everybody else? Is there like a big exam or something that I don't know about that everyone is studying for? Or did everyone go to the beach? Or what? Where is everybody? Ivan's good, okay. Justin. Morning, Justin. Yeah, where'd everybody go? Is it week 5 and people are starting to burn out, or what's going on? Caleb's good. Thika's good. Karen's thumbs up. Kate. Okay, here's what we're gonna do. Um, okay, so Banamir doesn't know if there's any other exam. Okay, so everyone just slept in. Okay, here's what we're gonna do. We'll take a little break, stretch our legs, and then when we get back, I have an article for you to read. And again, it has to do with racism, but it also has to do with learning to read an academic paper. And so I'm going to give you some tips on that to make it a little bit easier for you to do that. But let's take a break first. I'll see you back here shortly, and then we'll do that. Okay? So be right back. Okay, people, and we're back. So before we went on break, what I was trying to convince you of is that um, when you if you're looking to see if you have systemic or structural racism, you have to look at how the broad society works, right? And so you have to see some measures of how large groups of people are doing. It doesn't really do any good to look at one person or one situation because it doesn't necessarily tell you anything about how the society as a whole is doing. But we saw a number of different measures, different statistics that looked at people's economic and health and educational outcomes, and in many cases, and outcomes in the criminal justice system. And we kind of see the same pattern, right? The same minoritized groups are disadvantaged across all of these measures. And so that shows us that we have a problem with systemic racism. We have a societal machine that operates in a way that gives advantages to some people and disadvantages others. Okay, and so it is good that we can see that, but of course it becomes more difficult to figure out how to fix it because there's not one single cause. There's actually many causes. But the benefit of that is that we don't sort of have to address things sequentially. We can start making changes all over the place. And I think we're starting to see some of those changes in the US media now, where we're seeing a little bit of police reform. We're seeing calls to change how the police operate and sort of redefine what their job actually is. And we'll see more. We'll see more things coming out of this. I hope in the next weeks. But again, the causes of systemic racism are many, but that also means that there's lots of opportunities to fix them as well, right? There's lots of things we can do, but maybe we'll leave that for now. What I would like to talk about is this article that I have for you to read, and I want you to read it for a few reasons. Um, First reason, because it's relevant to what we're talking about. It has to do with racism, and in this case, it has to do with how racism occurs within the classroom. So that's good for us, I think, because it's a environment that we're all very used to. The second reason I want you to read it is because I want you to be able to find the argument in pieces of writing, in papers. And so this article has an argument because most journal articles do. The third reason I want you to read this is because it is a real, honest to God, academic article. Often in a class like this, I try to give you other things. I try to give you videos and newspaper articles because they're shorter and they're kind of easier to deal with. But this is a real academic journal article. And so I want you to have some experience reading one of those. But that said, this one is actually reasonably easy to read. It's written in a way that's very accessible, so it shouldn't be difficult to read. But I also want to give you some tips about how to read these type of articles, because again, if you go on to university, you are going to have to read these. The prof is going to assign these papers to you, and you have to read them. You have to deal with them. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. And so journal articles, I'm just going to go back here. Journal articles are mostly structured the same way. And so it doesn't matter if you wind up going into anthropology or sociology or psychology or chemistry or mass communication or anything, any scientific or academic discipline that you're thinking of. Most of them write their papers in a similar way. The structure is the same all the time. And so most of them have these pieces, okay? Again, it depends on what field you're looking at, and so a sociology article is going to be a little different than a chemistry article, but mostly they are structured the same way, okay? Most articles have an abstract, and so the abstract comes at the beginning. It looks like a little paragraph, and it's usually in smaller type or smaller font. And it just gives a brief summary of what the paper is. Okay. Um, then there's an introduction, which is an introduction, right? Um, Sometimes there'll be a theoretical framework, and so if the person is going to be interpreting their data according to a certain theory or a certain approach, then that's where the author will talk about it. Okay. Sometimes there'll be a literature review. And so what a literature review is that the author of the paper goes through all of the other stuff that's been written on their topic, basically to prove that they've read it. Okay. After that, sometimes there'll be a methodology. And so if there's an experiment that's happened in this paper, or if there has been some way of collecting data, maybe a survey, in the methodology, the author will explain how they did what they did. Okay. And so those of us in chemistry will probably be very familiar with methodologies, because that tells you how to do the experiment, right? It tells you what to measure and what to pour into what, and so on. Then they'll have data. So what kind of data did they collect in their experiment? And sometimes they'll have tables and lists of things. Yeah. Then they'll move on to the analysis. Sometimes they'll talk about how they analyze the data. And then finally, they'll come to the end of the paper and they will talk about the results of their experiment. So what actually happened. Sometimes there'll be a little discussion. So they'll talk about the results the results of their experiment and what it means. And then sometimes they'll come to a conclusion, right? And so sometimes if they have a hypothesis early on, they'll say that it was either confirmed or it was disconfirmed. So most papers are structured in that way. And again, sometimes it depends on what the paper is about, and it depends on whether you're in psychology or physics or whatever. But all of those papers are laid out the same. Now, here's what I'm going to tell you, and you can disagree with me, but if you are reading these for a class, for a university class, in a lot of cases you don't need to read the whole paper. Academic papers are usually long, and they're usually quite boring. And so you don't want to get bogged down in the detail of these papers, because not every detail is going to be critically important for you. If a prof gives you a paper in university and says, hey, I want you to read this paper, they're not asking you to memorize every detail of the paper, right? That's not the point of it. The point is to understand what the paper means. So the argument that the author is trying to make, and whether you believe it, whether you think it's a successful argument or not. That's what the prof is usually asking you to do. So the paper we'll read has all of these different points, or all of these different sections, but the trick is that I don't want you to read them all, okay? I want you to just read parts, and here's why, okay? Now, the abstract is always good to read. The abstract is a quick summary of what the paper is. That's great, because it'll only take you a minute or two to read, and you will kind of know what the paper is about. It's especially useful if you're looking for a paper to use for a paper that you're writing, because you can very quickly see, is this paper useful to me or not? And if it's not, you can chuck it, right? So the abstract is always worth reading because it's a really quick summary of what's going on. Always read that, okay? Introduction. You can read it if you want. Introductions are generally kind of, they kind of frame the topic, right? They give you sort of an idea of the greater purpose. Sometimes they're okay to read. Sometimes you can skip them. I'll leave that to your discretion, okay? Theoretical framework. You might want to look at this, but in many cases, you can skip over it. Maybe I'll just leave that there. Literature review, definitely skip it. Literature reviews are part of, if you do a master's, if you do a PhD, you have to do a big, long literature review, because you have to demonstrate to other people that you have read all of the relevant literature on this topic. If you're an undergrad student, it might help to look through it really quickly, but I wouldn't spend a lot of time because it's really just background. And unless you really need the background, I would skip it, okay? Data. You might want to look at the data that they collected. Often there's no analysis here, and so you might just see a lot of numbers or a lot of lists of things. Usually there's not really too much to read. Now, analysis is what you definitely want to read because that's where they take their data and they start to tell you what it means, okay? And so that's an important part of the paper, right? Because we've collected a bunch of data, we've analyzed it. What does it mean? What do we see as a result of this experiment or data collection or whatever, right? So you definitely want to read that one. And then finally, the results. Of course, you want to read the results. You want to read the conclusion. You want to know what the authors have decided that this whole thing means in the end, right? So even though even though a prof like me might assign you a paper that looks long, in many cases you can kind of jump through just to the important pieces. And again, if the prof asks you more specific questions, you can dig into these other sections, but often you can just skip through them. A lot of these, I'm going to sneeze in a second here. Or maybe not. a lot of these sections are written for academics, okay? So they're written for other scientists to prove that the author kind of knows what they're talking about. They've read what they should have read, and they are conducting their experiment in a way that is kind of valid. But again, if you're an undergrad student, you won't really be able to critique those things. You won't really be able to look at the literature review and say, hey, they missed this author, or you won't be able to look at the methodology and say, hey, they should have used this test and not this test. Usually we don't know that as undergrads, and so as a first year or second year student, you can probably get away with just skipping through parts of the paper to the good stuff, okay? So when we read this article, this is exactly what I want you to do. I want you to skip over big chunks of it because, again, they're kind of boring and they're not really going to be useful for us. We really want to know what the paper is about and what the author discovered in the end, right? So, you know, if this was a novel, I want you to, you know, skip most of the plot and jump straight to the end to figure out who killed who, okay? Does that make sense so far? Does that make sense so far? Give me something in the live chat that lets me know that you're alive and awake and listening to what I'm saying to you. Does that make sense? That's good? Okay. Because again, this is useful for you, because if you go on to university, you will get papers to read. Many of those papers, this is actually a short one. Lots of scientific papers are about 20 or 30 pages long, and you don't want to get lost in, you know, hundreds of pages of writing. You want to be able to sort of skip through and get the exact thing that you need, so that when the prof says, what's this paper about, you can intelligently tell them, and you won't have had to, you know, read hundreds of pages the night before. Yeah, okay, so let's try it out. The paper I want you to read is this one here, and it's called Race and Gender Oppression in the Classroom, the Experiences of Women Faculty of Color with White Male Students, okay? So the article is on Student Portal, and it's in Microsoft Teams under Files. It's both of those places. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to read the article, and I'd like you to answer these 3 questions. I want you to see if you can identify what the author's argument is. So what's the main thing they're trying to get us to believe, and what are their supporting reasons for that? And then I want you to tell me where we might see internalized dominance showing up, and where we see internalized oppression. Okay, and so just as a quick reminder, internalized dominance is where the dominant group acts out their superiority. Okay, they sort of give messages that they are the ones in power. Again, this often happens unintentionally and unconsciously. People often don't do it on purpose. Sometimes they do, but often they do it without really knowing. And again, internalized oppression. So where people act out the fact that they are in the inferior group. Okay, so they act in a way that communicates that, or they think in a way that communicates that. And again, often people in minoritized groups do this unintentionally as well. And so people often act out, whether they're in the dominant group or the minoritized group, really without being entirely aware of what they're doing. Okay, so that's kind of what I would like you to do. And I think it will probably take you the rest of today's class to finish reading the article and to answer these questions, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to post both of those things in Microsoft Teams. So I'll post the sections of the article that I want you to read, because again, I don't want you to read every word in the article. I just want you to read certain sections. And I'll post the questions in Microsoft Teams as well, so that you'll have those. And again, it'll probably take the rest of class to finish that and get it organized. Pay attention to trying to figure out this author's argument, because I want to, based on what we figure out about that argument, I want to do one more thing. I want to take it one step further, okay? Okay, is that cool? Do you have any questions that you want to ask me right now? I'm gonna put those things in. I'm gonna put those things in Microsoft Teams right now. Let me know if do you have questions, or are you good? Well, I know you're good. I know you're good. No questions? Okay. The sheet is good. Okay, everyone's good. Again, don't get freaked out. Sam's good. Good morning, Sam. I didn't see you before. Don't get freaked out by the article. It's actually very easy to read. It's about 14 pages long, but as I say, when you skip over sections, it's going to get a lot shorter for you. So don't panic about that. And again, it's written in a very it's written in a way that should be very easy to understand, I think, or easier to understand. And so again, this is a good opportunity for us to try reading a real academic article and get some experience sort of identifying what parts of the article are useful, because again, all of these scientific articles are often structured very similarly, and once you know the pieces, once you know how the article fits together, you sort of know what to skip over and what to read. And so, and again, the more of these you read, the better you kind of get at jumping through these. Okay, so that's what I'll do. I'm going to turn you loose, read the article, figure out the author's argument, and then look for where we see internalized oppression and internalized dominance happening for the students and the teachers that are discussed in this article. Type those things out, and then we'll deal with those first thing tomorrow morning in class, because I think it'll probably take you the rest of the class to finish reading the article and type out your answers, okay? So I will let you get to that. If you have any questions, of course, you can always ask me. I'm available in Teams or on email. Yeah, and I think I'll let you go to it. Okay, so for some of you, I'll see you at 10 o'clock in comparative cultures, and for the rest of you, I'll see you tomorrow. Okay, so good luck with the article. Don't panic. You can do it. It's not as long as it looks, and yeah, I'll see you tomorrow. Okay, so good luck with it.